Imagine waking up one morning, pouring your 5-year-old son a bowl of cereal, watching him eat, watching him smile, watching him pull on his little shoes, and then watching him walk out the front door, and never seeing him alive again. Now imagine that the people responsible for answering the hardest question of your life are the very people who were supposed to love him most. And imagine that more than 35 years would pass before anyone was ever made to answer for what happened to that little boy on a cold March morning in South Carolina. That is not a movie. That is not a television drama written to keep you on the edge of your seat. That is the real and documented story of a real child whose name was Justine Lee Turner, and whose death in the spring of 1989 would haunt a community, challenge a justice system, and break the hearts of everyone who refused to stop asking what happened on Horseshoe Road. This is not a story that ends with a conviction. It does not end with a tearful courtroom verdict and a family finally exhaling after decades of pain. It ends with a judge's gavel and a ruling that landed like a punch to the stomach of everyone who had spent their lives fighting for a 5-year-old boy who never got to grow up. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about the ending, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to Moncks Corner, South Carolina. We have to go back to a modest house on a dirt road. We have to go back to a bowl of cinnamon cereal and a little boy with blonde hair who walked toward a dirt road one morning and never came home. Here on Coldcase Crimelab, we fight for the ones who can no longer fight for themselves. Before we go any further into this story, please take 5 seconds and hit that like button right now. Then drop a comment below telling us you are here for Justine. And if you are not already subscribed to Coldcase Crimelab, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a case. Every single like, every comment, and every subscription tells the algorithm that stories like this one matter. Let us make sure Justine Lee Turner is never forgotten. To truly understand what happened to Justine Lee Turner and why the investigation unfolded the way it did, you first have to understand the world he lived in. Not just the house and the family, but the entire context, the town, the time, the culture, and the technological and legal landscape of the late 1980s in rural South Carolina. Because that world was not our world. The tools available to law enforcement, the cultural assumptions about child safety and family violence, the legal frameworks governing evidence and prosecution, and the social dynamics of a small southern community in 1989 were fundamentally different from what exists today. Those differences shaped this case in ways that cannot be fully understood without spending time in that world. Moncks Corner sits in Berkeley County, South Carolina, approximately 30 miles north of Charleston. In the late 1980s, it was the kind of small southern town that people who grew up in small southern towns will immediately recognize. Everybody knew everybody. Neighbors waved from porches. Children moved between yards and fields and dirt roads without their parents spending much time worrying, because the community itself was a kind of watchful presence that felt safe and familiar. It was not a wealthy place. It was not a glamorous place. But it had the deep, specific character of a place where people had lived alongside each other for generations, where the rhythms of daily life were predictable and communal, and where the arrival of real tragedy felt like something that happened elsewhere, to other people, not here. The area around Moncks Corner in those years was deeply rural. Modest homes sat on wide plots of land separated by stretches of pine trees and long red dirt roads. Families did not have much, but what they had they valued, and the informal bonds of community were a genuine form of social security in a place where institutional resources were limited. There was a sense, in towns like Moncks Corner in 1989, that the community itself was a safety net, that people were looked after by neighbors, that children were watched by everyone's eyes, and that danger, if it came, would be seen coming from a distance. It was into this world that Justine Lee Turner had been born. He was 5 years old in the late winter of 1989, a kindergartner with blonde hair who, by every account that has been preserved in news reports, court documents, and the memories of the family members who carried his story forward, was a sweet and entirely ordinary little boy. He lived with his biological father, Victor Lee Turner, and his stepmother, who was then known as Pamela Turner, though decades later she would legally change her name to Megan, a detail that investigators and family members alike would find significant. The family home sat at 214 Horseshoe Road in Monk's Corner, a modest property in the rural landscape that characterized the area surrounding the town. Victor Turner worked as a pipe welder for General Dynamics. He was a working man, up and out of the house early, leaving each morning to put in his hours while Pamela managed the home. By the accounts given to investigators in those early days, she was the primary caregiver who was present during the morning routine, who was there when Justine ate breakfast and got ready for school, and who was there, or claimed to be, when Justine was last seen alive in that house. Parked on the grounds of the Turner property was a small truck camper. That camper would later become one of the most significant and disturbing details in this entire case, but in the early months of 1989, it was just another unremarkable fixture of a working-class rural home. No one looking at it from the road would have seen anything alarming. It was just a camper, sitting there in the way that vehicles and outbuildings accumulate on rural properties, part of the background landscape of an ordinary family's life. Justine also had a small dog named Freeway, a terrier who was part of the household and who was, presumably, as familiar and beloved a presence to a 5-year-old as dogs always are to children of that age. That dog, and the leash and collar Freeway wore, would eventually become one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the investigation into Justine's death. Investigators would come to believe that the dog collar, belonging to Justine's own pet, had been used as the murder weapon. The collar of a child's dog. The single most ordinary, innocent item in a household. Used to take the life of the child who loved that dog. If you are looking for a detail that encapsulates the particular cruelty of what investigators believed happened to Justine Lee Turner, that is perhaps the most devastating one in this entire story. What we know about Justine himself is limited to the fragments preserved across decades of news reports, legal documents, and the testimony of family members who refused to let his memory dissolve. His cousin Amy Parsons, who was only 8 years old when Justine was killed, grew up to become the most visible and persistent advocate for justice in this case. Through her voice, and the voices of others who loved him, we know that Justine was an entirely normal kindergartner doing entirely normal kindergartner things, going to school, eating his favorite cereal, playing with his dog, living the ordinary and precious daily life of a small child who had no reason to know that his world was not safe. That is who Justine Lee Turner was. That is the person at the center of this story. And it is important to hold that image clearly in mind as this story goes forward, because the legal proceedings and the forensic details and the decades of investigative work can sometimes make it easy to lose sight of the human reality at the core of everything. At the core of everything is a little boy with blonde hair and a bowl of cinnamon cereal. Everything else is about what was done to him and whether anyone was ever made to answer for it. Friday, March 3, 1989. The morning began the way all school day mornings begin for a 5-year-old. Breakfast first. Justine reportedly ate a bowl of his favorite cereal, the cinnamon kind, sitting at the table in the way that small children sit at tables, with a certain comfortable, absorbed quality, the whole body present in the task, nothing else on the mind. It was a small, ordinary moment. It was also the last meal Justine Lee Turner ever ate. And the contents of his stomach at the time of his autopsy would later help investigators narrow down the window of time in which he was killed, because the science of digestion is specific enough, under some circumstances, to tell investigators roughly how long after a meal a person died. Victor Turner had already left for work by the time the morning school routine began. He worked early shifts, and his alibi for the morning would be confirmed by his employer. He was at work. He was not at home. That left Pamela Turner alone with Justine for the time between Victor's departure and the moment when Justine was supposed to walk down the dirt road to the neighbor's house and catch the school bus. The school bus that Justine rode to kindergarten followed a regular route through the area. It did not stop at the Turner home itself, but at a neighbor's house approximately 100 yards down the dirt road, a short, familiar walk that Justine had made on every school day morning, a walk measured in steps rather than miles, a walk that a 5-year-old could complete in under 2 minutes without any difficulty. Every morning, Justine was supposed to walk those 100 yards, join the other children waiting at the neighbor's house, and climb aboard the bus. It was such a short walk. Such a routine, unremarkable thing. The kind of thing that happens in small communities everywhere, every school day, so many times that no one thinks twice about it. On that Friday morning, Justine never covered it. According to the account that Pamela Turner gave to investigators, she was in the shower at the time Justine left the house that morning. She said she did not accompany him outside. She said she believed he had walked to the bus stop as usual, just as he always did, and that she had not seen him leave because she was in the shower. She said she would not know anything was wrong until that afternoon, when she walked to the neighbor's house to meet the school bus and discovered that Justine was not on it. The problem with this story, and investigators knew it almost immediately, was that it was contradicted by every witness who had any position to observe what happened that morning. The neighbor whose house served as the bus stop had gone outside with her own grandson that morning to wait for the bus. She stood there in the cool March air, watching the road, watching for the children to come. She watched and waited. She never saw Justine. He never appeared at the end of that dirt road. He never walked into her driveway. He never climbed onto that bus. Not only had Justine failed to get off the afternoon bus, he had never gotten on the morning bus in the first place. The school confirmed it. Justine Turner had not been in class that day. He had not arrived at his kindergarten. Not a single teacher or staff member or fellow student had seen him. The bus driver had not seen him. The neighbor had not seen him. The other children waiting for the bus had not seen him. From the moment he was supposed to have stepped out the front door of the house at 214 Horseshoe Road and walked down that dirt road, Justine Lee Turner had simply ceased to exist in the visible world. Pamela Turner reportedly contacted the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office at approximately 3 in the afternoon on March 3, 1989, to report that Justine had not gotten off the school bus. That was the story she told. That was the version of events she presented to the deputies who responded. But from the very beginning, investigators sensed that there was something deeply wrong with that story. Because the truth that would take 35 years to be formally charged, and that the courts would ultimately refuse to let a jury decide, was that Justine had almost certainly been dead long before the school bus had made its first stop that morning. Investigators would come to believe, based on the forensic analysis of the stomach contents found during Justine's autopsy, that the boy had died very shortly after eating that bowl of cinnamon cereal. They believed he had died in the late evening of March 2 or in the early morning hours of March 3, before the school day had even begun. They believed he had been killed inside the home on Horseshoe Road. And they believed that the story about the shower, the story about the school bus, the story about Pamela not knowing anything was wrong until the afternoon, was a fabrication. A cover story constructed to create the appearance that Justine had left the house alive and met his fate somewhere outside, at the hands of some unknown person on the road or near the bus stop. When the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office responded to the report that afternoon, they launched what would become a 2-day organized search of the surrounding area. Deputies canvassed the neighborhood. They searched the woods and fields around Horseshoe Road. They organized community volunteers who turned out to look for a missing kindergartner, because in a town like Monk's Corner, a missing child was not an abstraction, it was everyone's emergency, everyone's fear, everyone's responsibility. The search was methodical and wide-ranging. Deputies and volunteers spread out across the rural landscape, calling Justine's name, checking every culvert and ditch and outbuilding and anywhere a small child might have wandered or been taken. The community that turned out reflected the character of that close-knit place, people who did not need to know Justine personally to know that he was one of theirs, and that his disappearance was something that required their presence and their effort. Victor Turner returned from work to find his home surrounded by law enforcement and the terrible reality that his son was missing. Whatever his knowledge of events at that point, Victor participated in the search and presented the appearance of a concerned and frightened father desperate to find his child. For 2 full days, the search continued and found nothing. No trace of Justine anywhere in the surrounding woods and fields. No clothing. No signs of a struggle or an abduction. No witnesses who had seen a child walking along the road. No footprints in the dirt. Nothing at all. It was as if Justine had simply vanished into the morning air. Investigators began to consider, in those early days, the possibility that Justine might have been abducted. In 1989, child abductions were a very real and very present fear across the United States. The era of milk carton children was in full effect. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had been founded only 5 years earlier, in the wake of highly publicized child disappearances that had changed the national conversation about child safety. Every parent in America had been told to teach their kids about strangers. The idea that a child might walk out a door and be taken by an unknown person was terrifying but not unthinkable. And if Justine had been taken by someone passing through the area, that would explain why no trace of him had been found locally. But there was another explanation. One that investigators began to quietly consider even as the public search continued. An explanation that focused not on an unknown stranger, but on the people who were supposed to have been the last to see Justine alive. An explanation that centered on the house at 214 Horseshoe Road. An explanation that the evidence, as it would slowly and painfully emerge, seemed to support in ways that could not be easily dismissed. On the morning of March 5, 1989, the third day of the search, a local television news crew from WCBD was present at the Turner property. They were documenting the ongoing search effort, the kind of coverage that missing child cases attracted in that era. The camera was rolling. The crew was capturing the organized activity of another morning's search. Victor Turner entered the family's small truck camper. Within seconds, according to the subsequent affidavit filed by investigators who reviewed that footage decades later, he backed out. He said words that would be analyzed and discussed and debated for the next 35 years. He said, in effect, that his son was inside. He said somebody had hurt him. Justine Lee Turner's body was found in a storage compartment inside that camper. A small cabinet. A space beneath a seat. A space so confined that a 5-year-old's body had to be folded to fit inside it. The camper was parked on the property of the Turner home. Investigators and volunteers had been searching the surrounding area for 2 days. Reports from those searches indicated that the camper had been checked. And yet here, on the morning of the third day, Victor Turner walked in and found his son within seconds of entering the vehicle. The discovery was shattering. For the community volunteers who had spent 2 days calling Justine's name across fields and through woods, it was a horror. For Justine's family, his extended family, his maternal relatives who would spend the next 3 decades fighting for justice, it was the beginning of a grief that would not lift, and a set of questions that would not be answered, for an unbearably long time. The autopsy that followed revealed the full truth of what Justine Lee Turner had endured. The medical examiner's findings were stark and devastating. Justine had been sexually assaulted. And he had been strangled. He had died of asphyxiation due to strangulation by ligature, meaning something had been wrapped around his small neck and pulled tight until he could no longer breathe. He had died, the forensic evidence suggested, a short time after consuming his last meal. Not after he left for school. Not somewhere on the road between his front door and the neighbor's driveway. Before he ever had the chance to leave. One detail from the discovery was particularly haunting and would generate decades of speculation and theory. When investigators found Justine's body, there were reported to be beads of sweat on his head, leading some investigators at the time to theorize that his body might have been refrigerated for a period before being moved to the camper. If true, that detail suggested a degree of premeditation and deliberateness in the concealment of his death that was deeply chilling, not a panicked act of someone trying to hide what they had done, but a calculated, cold decision about how to manage the evidence. And in one small hand, Justine was clutching a clump of animal hair. The hair of a dog, investigators would later believe. The hair of Freeway, his own terrier. A child, in the final moments or aftermath of his life, holding on to the fur of the animal he loved. If you want to understand why this case stayed with the investigators who worked it, why it stayed with the family who lived with it, why it stays with everyone who hears it, that image is the reason. A 5-year-old boy, clutching his dog's fur. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery of Justine's body, the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office launched a murder investigation. And almost immediately, the attention of investigators turned to Pamela Turner. Victor Turner had an alibi. His employer confirmed he had been at work during the morning hours of March 3, the window during which investigators believed Justine had been killed. Victor was not at home during that time. That left Pamela Turner as the adult who had been alone with Justine in the house during the period when the forensic evidence indicated he had died. What investigators found when they began to look closely at Pamela Turner was a collection of details and inconsistencies that deepened their suspicion considerably. Her account of the morning kept changing in small but significant ways. Witnesses described what they characterized as peculiar behavior and strange statements she made to people around her in the aftermath of Justine's death, the kind of statements and behaviors that experienced investigators recognize as inconsistent with the responses of a genuinely shocked and grieving innocent person. She had deviated, investigators noted, from her normal morning routine on the specific day Justine disappeared. And her story about the shower and the school bus, when subjected to the scrutiny of the witness accounts from the neighbor and the school, simply did not hold together. Then there was the dog leash. A dog leash was found in the kitchen of the Turner home. Freeway's leash. Investigators looked at that leash, and at the description of the strangulation wounds on Justine's neck, and they began to develop a theory. They believed that the dog collar, used in conjunction with that leash, had been the murder weapon. Something that belonged to Justine's own pet. Something that should have represented nothing more threatening than the ordinary life of a child and his dog. Used to take that child's life. The original investigator on the case, a detective named Sidney Wren, would later describe his deep frustration with the gap between what he knew and what he could prove. He had the inconsistencies in Pamela Turner's story. He had the behavioral evidence. He had the physical circumstances of how and where Justine's body was found. He had the logical inferences about who had access to the camper and who was familiar with its layout. He had all of this. But what he did not have, in 1989 and the early years of the 1990s, was the kind of forensic evidence that could take those circumstances and those inferences and turn them into an airtight case in a court of law. DNA analysis in 1989 was in its absolute infancy. The FBI had only begun using DNA testing in criminal cases in 1988, just 1 year before Justine's death. At the level of a local sheriff's office in rural South Carolina, DNA was not a practical investigative tool. There were no databases. There were no rapid testing protocols. There were no standardized procedures for collecting and preserving biological evidence for future analysis. What law enforcement in Berkeley County had was witness testimony, physical evidence that could be observed and documented with the tools then available, and investigative reasoning based on the logical interpretation of what those tools showed. In 1990, roughly a year after Justine's death, the Berkeley County Coroner's Office held a formal inquest into his death, a legal process that allowed investigators and authorities to examine the available evidence and reach a formal conclusion about what it showed. The inquest resulted in a finding that Pamela Turner should be held for further action in connection with Justine's death. That was a significant formal determination, and it was followed, in February of that year, by a Berkeley County grand jury returning an indictment charging Pamela Turner with murder. She was arrested. She was charged. For a brief moment, it appeared that the legal process was going to deliver what Justine's family believed was the truth. But the charges did not hold. Later in 1990, the charges against Pamela Turner were dismissed without prejudice. The distinction between dismissal without prejudice and dismissal with prejudice is crucial to understanding everything that followed. Dismissal without prejudice means that the charges can be brought again if new evidence emerges. The door is left open. The case is not formally closed. But in practical terms, what happened in 1990 was that Pamela Turner walked free, because the prosecutors and the court determined that the evidence as it then existed was not sufficient to support a murder conviction. Sidney Wren's circumstantial case, however compelling it may have appeared to those who worked the investigation and knew the details, was not enough to clear the legal bar for a prosecution. Pamela Turner changed her name. She legally changed it from Pamela to Megan, a decision that investigators and family members would point to for decades as a significant behavioral indicator, someone trying to distance themselves from their past identity in connection with a murder investigation. She and Victor Turner left Berkeley County, eventually settling in Cross Hill, South Carolina, in the upstate region of the state, approximately 3.5 hours north of Moncks Corner. They moved away from the community where Justine had lived and died. They left behind the neighbors, the sheriff's office, the family members who had loved Justine and who continued to believe with absolute certainty that they knew who had killed him. And they went silent. According to Sheriff Dwayne Lewis, who would later take over the investigation, not once in the years and decades that followed did Victor Turner, Justine's biological father, call the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office to ask what progress was being made in finding the person who killed his 5-year-old son. Not one phone call. Not one inquiry. Not one expression of a father's demand for answers. That silence, the sheriff would later say publicly, told him everything he needed to know. For the family of Justine Lee Turner, the years after the charges were dropped were a long and painful wilderness of unresolved grief. Justine's maternal relatives, his cousins, his grandparents, the people who had loved him as blood kin, never stopped believing they knew the truth. They never stopped grieving. And they never stopped pushing for someone in authority to look at the case again with fresh eyes. Amy Parsons was 8 years old when Justine was killed. She grew up carrying that loss in a way that shaped her adult identity. She became the family's primary public voice, attending meetings with successive sheriffs when they were newly elected, speaking to journalists when the case's anniversaries brought media attention back to Berkeley County, making sure that the name Justine Lee Turner did not simply dissolve into the archive of forgotten cases. She made herself an inconvenient presence in the bureaucracy of grief, a reminder that this case had not closed, that a family was still waiting, that a child's murder was still unsolved. Her cousin Denise Finley remembered the specific moment her grandfather received the phone call, the call saying Justine was missing and had not gotten off the school bus. She carried that memory for decades. The family as a whole carried what might be called the particular burden of the bereaved who believe they know the truth but cannot make the system agree with them, a burden that is different from ordinary grief because it is compounded by a specific, sustained frustration. Not just the loss. The injustice of the loss. The injustice of knowing and not being believed, of waiting and not being answered, of fighting and not being heard. Meanwhile, Victor and Megan Turner, as she was now known, lived their lives in Cross Hill. By their own later account, those years were not easy. They described a kind of social isolation born of suspicion, a sense of being perpetually under a cloud, of having lost relationships and community because of the accusation that had been made and then formally dropped but never truly gone away. Megan Turner would later describe being afraid to talk to people, relying only on siblings for support, living in silence because any word she said might be interpreted through the lens of suspicion. Whether that description reflects the reality of an innocent person living under unjust suspicion, or the reality of a guilty person managing the consequences of what they did and were never convicted for, it is impossible to determine from the outside. What is certain is that the case was not over for anyone, not for the family, not for law enforcement, and apparently not for the Turners themselves. Periodically, the case attracted renewed attention. In 2016, more than 27 years after Justine's death, local news outlets covered the case, and Amy Parsons gave interviews that captured both the enduring grief of Justine's family and her quiet, persistent hope that justice might still be possible. She spoke about what it was like to carry this knowledge through a life. About growing up in a community where people either knew the story or did not, where some believed what she believed and others had moved on. And she spoke about her hope that a new sheriff, or a new technology, or a new witness, might someday change the calculus of what could be proven. In 2018, the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office made a public appeal for new leads in the case, releasing details that had not previously been widely reported, the neighbor's account of never seeing Justine walk to the bus, the account of Pamela's claimed shower, the confirmation that Justine had never boarded the morning bus. The appeal was both an acknowledgement that the case remained open and an attempt to dislodge any information that might be sitting in someone's memory or conscience. In April of 2021, something changed significantly. The Berkeley County Sheriff's Office made a formal, institutional decision to reopen the Justine Turner case for review by its cold case unit. This was not a casual revisit. It was a deliberate and systematic reassessment of every piece of physical evidence that had been preserved across the more than 30 years since Justine's death, with a specific focus on whether modern forensic technology could produce results that had been impossible to obtain in earlier decades. The physical evidence collected at the original crime scene and from the autopsy was reevaluated and submitted to forensic pathologists and to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known across the state as SLED, for analysis using the best available modern techniques. Cold case investigators, including Lieutenant Dean Kakinda, who had been working on the case for several years before the formal reopening, went through old reports and old photographs and old witness statements and old forensic data with the benefit of fresh perspective and 30 additional years of advances in forensic science. What they were looking for, above everything else, was a way to close the gap between what investigators had always believed and what they could prove. The circumstantial case against Pamela Turner, now Megan Turner, had always been compelling to the people who worked the investigation. But compelling was not the same as provable. They needed something that could withstand the scrutiny of a modern courtroom. In the fibers, they believed they found it. The forensic examination conducted by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division focused on a ligature, an item that can be used to bind or strangle, that had been recovered from inside the Turner residence during the original investigation. Investigators had believed for decades that this item, possibly used in conjunction with the dog leash and collar found in the kitchen, had been the instrument used to strangle Justine. Now, with modern forensic techniques including advanced microscopy and chemical analysis, they were able to conduct a detailed examination of the fibers present on that ligature and compare them to fibers extracted from the inside of Justine's shirt collar, the collar of the shirt the boy was wearing when he was killed. The results were, according to investigators and the affidavits they would later file, a significant match. Fiber evidence collected from the ligature was found to be physically and chemically consistent with the material taken from the inside of Justine's shirt collar. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division determined that the proffered ligature, the one found at the Turner residence, had the physical characteristics capable of causing the strangulation wounds documented on Justine's neck during his autopsy. The forensic investigation also produced important conclusions about the concealment of Justine's body. The affidavit filed by investigators in support of the eventual arrests made a point that was simple but devastating in its logical force. The specific location inside the camper where Justine's body had been concealed, that small cabinet beneath a seat, highly suggested familiarity with the camper and its floor plan. Someone who knew that camper well had chosen that specific hiding place. This was not a random, panicked choice. It was a deliberate selection made by someone with intimate knowledge of the vehicle's layout. And the investigation confirmed that only Victor and Megan Turner possessed keys to that camper. Only they had regular access. Only they would have known that cabinet was there. The investigation also confirmed, more definitively than ever before, that Justine had not left the Turner residence under his own power on the morning of March 3, 1989. He had not walked down that dirt road. He had not been taken by a stranger from the road or the bus stop. The affidavit used a specific word that is worth dwelling on for a moment. It said that Justine had been carried from the residence to the camper. Carried. Not walked. Not led. Carried. By someone who needed to move his body after his death. The Cold Case Unit, working alongside the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and the Ninth Circuit Solicitor's Office, concluded that they had assembled a case sufficient to bring to a prosecutor. In January of 2024, after more than 3 years of this renewed investigation, they acted on that conclusion. On January 9, 2024, Berkeley County Sheriff Dwayne Lewis stood before a crowd of approximately 50 people at a press conference that many of those present had waited their entire adult lives to see. Victor Lee Turner and Megan Renee Turner had been arrested at their residence in Cross Hill, South Carolina, with the assistance of the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office. They were both charged with murder in the death of Justine Lee Turner. They were transported to the Hill-Finklia Detention Center in Moncks Corner, the very community where Justine had lived and died 34 years before. Victor Lee Turner was 69 years old at the time of his arrest. Megan Turner was 63. Sheriff Lewis spoke at that press conference with a combination of professional measured language and genuine human feeling that was evident to everyone present. He spoke about what Justine could have been. He could have graduated high school, the sheriff said. He could have gone to college. He could have gotten married. He could have had children of his own. He could have been a productive citizen walking around at 40 years old. Instead, Sheriff Lewis said, "We believe these two people took that away from us." For Amy Parsons, standing in that crowd, the arrests were a moment that she had held in her imagination for 35 years. She thanked God. She said that from the very beginning, from the time she was 8 years old and this terrible thing happened, her family had been confident about who murdered Justine. Her parents had believed it. Her grandparents had believed it. And they had spent decades waiting for the justice system to arrive at what they already knew. She also said something that was pointed and significant and that cut through the official language of the press conference with the clarity that only someone who has personally experienced this kind of loss can manage. She said that the Turners should not have been free for 34 years. Those words contained an entire history of grief and frustration and the specific anger of a family that had done everything right, that had pushed and advocated and refused to be silent, and had still had to wait 34 years for an arrest. If you are still watching at this point in Justine's story, drop a comment right now with the words, "I am here for Justine." We want to know who is truly following this case, who is standing with this little boy and with the family that never stopped fighting for him. Let us see how many of you are still here. Your comments mean everything, and they tell the world that Justine Lee Turner's story deserves to be heard. When the arrest affidavits were made public, the full legal case against Victor and Megan Turner came into sharper focus. The documents laid out, in the careful and clinical language of legal proceedings, the reasoning that had led investigators to conclude that both of Justine's parents had played a role in his death and in the deliberate concealment of his body. On the question of timing, the affidavit stated that investigators believed Justine had been killed in the late evening of March 2 or the early morning hours of March 3, 1989. The forensic pathologist's analysis of the autopsy findings, particularly the examination of stomach contents, supported the conclusion that Justine had died a short time after consuming his last meal, the cinnamon cereal. If he died shortly after eating, and if he ate breakfast just before the school day began, then he was dead before the school bus ever made its first stop. The story of the shower and the afternoon bus stop discovery was, investigators maintained, a fabrication. On the question of the murder weapon, the affidavits described the ligature found at the Turner residence and the fiber analysis connecting it to Justine's shirt collar. Berkeley County Sheriff investigators believed specifically that a dog collar, used with the leash found in the kitchen, had been the instrument of strangulation. The dog collar belonging to Freeway. The collar of Justine's own pet. Investigators went to remarkable lengths to try to recover that collar. They knew that after Justine's death, Megan Turner had given Freeway away to a woman named Linda Cook. They tried to locate the collar through that chain of custody. At some point, they even attempted to exhume the dog's remains in hopes of finding the original collar buried with or near the animal. That effort came to nothing. The collar could not be found. Without it, the physical item that investigators believed was the murder weapon remained missing, and the absence of that specific piece of evidence would become one of the most significant factors in the subsequent legal proceedings. On the question of concealment, the affidavits were specific and analytical. Only the Turners had keys to the camper. The body had been hidden in a location that required intimate knowledge of the vehicle. Someone had carried Justine from the house, and the word carried is important, because it tells us that Justine was not able to walk, was not alive and moving under his own power, when he was moved. He was carried. His body was placed deliberately in that specific hidden space by someone who knew it was there and who chose it deliberately as a place of concealment. The affidavits also noted something that Megan Turner had reportedly said to witnesses, that she had had an altercation with Justine in the period before his disappearance was reported. This detail, which she had not disclosed to law enforcement during the original investigation, was significant in multiple ways. It placed her in direct conflict with Justine in the window of time during which investigators believed he died. And it suggested that the domestic reality of that morning was very different from the calm, routine household morning she had described to deputies. The behavioral evidence laid out in the affidavits painted a picture that investigators found deeply telling. Both Victor and Megan Turner, in 34 years, had never once called the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office to ask what was being done to find Justine's killer. Not one call. In 34 years of an open murder investigation into the death of a 5-year-old child, Victor's own biological son, not one phone call from his father asking about the case. Sheriff Lewis had already noted this publicly, but seeing it stated in a legal document gave it a new and particular weight. The case being assembled against the Turners was, as the original case had always been, a circumstantial case. There was no single piece of evidence that was by itself conclusive. What there was, instead, was an accumulation, a layering of forensic findings, behavioral patterns, inconsistent statements, physical evidence, witness testimony, and logical inferences, that investigators and prosecutors believed, taken together, pointed in one direction with sufficient force to bring to a jury. But before any jury could hear it, there was a legal hurdle to clear. And that hurdle would ultimately prove insurmountable. The defense attorneys for Victor and Megan Turner immediately began working on a motion to dismiss the charges. And in March of 2024, as that motion was being formally argued before a judge, the defense introduced something that had never before appeared in the public narrative of this case. The name Richard Mark Evenitz. Evenitz was a man from Columbia, South Carolina, who was linked definitively to the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of 3 young children in Virginia in the late 1990s. He was identified as a suspect in those crimes and was being actively pursued by law enforcement in 2002 when he was stopped by police in Sarasota, Florida. Rather than be taken into custody, he shot himself. He died from that self-inflicted wound. He never stood trial. And before he died, he told his sister by telephone that he had committed more crimes than he could remember. The implication of that statement, that the 3 known Virginia murders were not the extent of his criminal history, was never formally investigated to any conclusion. The letter introducing the Evenitz angle to the defense came from Deidre Enright, a law professor at the University of Virginia School of Law and the director of its Innocence Project. The Innocence Project movement in the United States has historically focused on exonerating the wrongfully convicted, but the spirit of Enright's involvement here was consistent with that mission, ensuring that no one is prosecuted based on an incomplete or tunnel vision investigation. In her letter, Enright wrote that she had discovered that Evenitz, who had served in the United States Navy and whose ship had traveled to various ports, arrived in Charleston, South Carolina on March 3, 1989, the same day Justine Turner was reported missing. And she noted that Evenitz's pattern of known crimes involved targeting young children near bus stops and school routes, in exactly the kind of rural community where Justine lived. Defense attorney Sean Kent presented this information to the court with vigor. He argued that his clients had spent 35 years living under suspicion and public condemnation while a serial child killer who might have been responsible for Justine's death was never investigated. He argued that the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office had been operating with tunnel vision from day one, had decided from the very beginning that the Turners were guilty and had never seriously considered any alternative explanation. Megan Turner herself made this point directly and emotionally at a press conference after the dismissal hearing. "There is a serial killer out there," she said, "who possibly could be the person who did it. He was never looked at. We were always the ones under suspicion." The Berkeley County Sheriff's Office did not formally investigate the Evenitz angle. Sheriff Lewis and his investigators maintained their conviction that the evidence pointed to Victor and Megan Turner and that the Evenitz theory was not credible enough to redirect the investigation. That decision, the decision not to investigate a possible alternative suspect, became one of the defense's central arguments for why the case should be dismissed. The Evenitz theory, considered with clear eyes, is genuinely notable. A known child killer with a specific pattern of targeting children near bus stops was in the Charleston area on the day a child near Charleston was killed near a bus stop. That coincidence is real and cannot simply be dismissed. At the same time, the forensic evidence connecting the ligature found inside the Turner home to the wounds on Justine's neck is harder to explain if the killer was an outside perpetrator who would not have had access to items inside that house. The two sets of evidence point in different directions, and the tension between them represents the core uncertainty that the dismissal of charges would ultimately leave permanently unresolved. On March 14, 2024, Victor Lee Turner and Megan Renee Turner appeared in a Berkeley County courtroom for the formal hearing on their joint motion to dismiss the murder charges. The defense arguments were extensive and covered multiple lines of attack. The first and most fundamental argument was one of fairness. 34 years had passed between Justine's death and the filing of charges. The defense argued that no defendant could receive a fair trial under such circumstances. Approximately 20 specific individuals who would have been critical to the defense case were dead. Other potential witnesses were medically unavailable due to age or illness. People who had known the Turners, who could speak to their characters and their behaviors and the details of their lives in 1989, were simply gone. The passage of 34 years had eroded the human infrastructure of the case in ways that could not be remedied by any amount of prosecutorial effort or judicial management. The second line of attack focused on the physical evidence that no longer existed. The camper in which Justine's body had been found was gone. It had not been preserved as a crime scene exhibit across the decades. Clothing items with potential forensic significance, items with urine stains that might have told a forensic story, could no longer be located. And most critically, the dog collar that investigators believed had been the murder weapon could not be found. The linchpin of the prosecution's narrative about how Justine was killed was missing. Without the collar, the defense argued, the prosecution's theory about the murder weapon was unsupported by the physical item that would have been most central to proving it. The third argument, as we have discussed, was the evidence theory and the claim of tunnel vision in the original investigation. Deputy Solicitor Amy Williams presented the prosecution's case with careful attention to the significance of the forensic work that had been done during the cold case reinvestigation. She acknowledged that there was no new physical evidence per se, but argued that the new forensic conclusions drawn from old evidence, particularly the fiber analysis, were significant. She argued that the pattern of behavior by the Turners, the inconsistencies in their accounts, the concealment of Justine's body, and the physical evidence as analyzed by modern forensic science added up to a case that deserved to be heard by a jury of 12 people. She argued that the families of murder victims deserved their day in court, and that a 5-year-old child who was strangled and sexually assaulted deserved the full weight of the legal process applied on his behalf. The judge took the arguments under consideration. The courtroom fell quiet. And then, on June 7, 2024, 9th Judicial Circuit Court Judge Roger Young issued his ruling. He dismissed the charges against both Victor Lee Turner and Megan Renee Turner. With prejudice. With prejudice. Those two words were the most devastating in the entire history of this case. Dismissal with prejudice is final and permanent. It cannot be appealed. It cannot be reversed. It means that the charges are gone forever. It means that no matter what evidence might someday emerge, no matter what confession might be made, no matter what new forensic technology might be developed, no matter what witness might finally come forward after decades of silence, Victor and Megan Turner could never again be charged with the murder of Justine Lee Turner. The door that had been left open in 1990, when the original charges were dismissed without prejudice specifically to allow for the possibility of future prosecution if new evidence emerged, was now sealed shut by a judicial order that had no appeal and no remedy. Judge Young's reasoning centered on the concept of pre-indictment delay and its impact on the defendant's right to a fair trial. The court found that the delay in bringing charges, 34 years from Justine's death to the 2024 indictment, had caused substantial and irreversible prejudice to both defendants. The approximately 20 individuals who were critical to the defense case were dead or unavailable. The camper was gone. The urine-stained clothing was gone. The dog collar was gone. The evidence had been eroded by time in ways that fundamentally compromised the defendant's ability to mount a meaningful defense. The ruling was, from a purely legal standpoint, not entirely shocking to the attorneys who had been following the case. Lawyers who specialize in this area of law had noted throughout the proceedings that the age of the case and the loss of evidence presented serious structural obstacles for the prosecution. A 34-year-old murder case with missing physical evidence and dozens of dead witnesses is an extraordinarily difficult case to bring successfully, even when the underlying investigation is strong and the forensic analysis is competent. The law's requirement that defendants be able to confront the evidence against them and mount a defense is not a technicality, it is a foundational principle of the justice system. And when that principle is in direct tension with the desire to prosecute a murder, the principle wins. But the legal logic and the human reality of the ruling were two entirely different things. For Amy Parsons and for every member of Justine's family who had spent decades fighting for this moment, the ruling was a body blow of the most devastating kind. The family issued a statement through the solicitor's office. It said plainly that the justice system had failed an innocent 5-year-old boy. It acknowledged that Sheriff Lewis and his team had done everything within their power, that they had pursued every avenue, applied every resource, brought every available expertise to bear on this case, and that they deserved recognition and gratitude for that effort. But it said that on June 7, 2024, justice had been evaded. And it said something that was spiritual in its tone and final in its register, that the people responsible for Justine's death had chosen to remain silent rather than face justice in a human court, and that they would face a final judgment that no judicial ruling could reach. Those words, "The justice system failed an innocent 5-year-old boy," are the truest and most important words in this entire story. They are the words of a family that did everything right. They asked for help. They pushed. They advocated. They gave interviews and attended meetings and refused to accept silence. They provided information. They kept the case alive for 35 years. They did not let Justine be forgotten. And they were failed. Not by bad intent or individual negligence, but by the accumulated weight of time, by the slow erosion of evidence and witnesses, and ultimately by the gap between truth and what the law can prove. After the ruling, Victor and Megan Turner held their own press conference on the steps of the Berkeley County Courthouse. Megan Turner spoke first and spoke at length. "We did not do it," she said. "Every little thing that came up, everybody tried to point in our direction. Nobody ever looked at the actual facts. It was like a decision had been made from day one and that was the only way things were going to go. People never heard our side of the story." She described 35 years of social isolation. Of being afraid to talk to people. Of losing friends and relationships because of the suspicion that had followed her and Victor wherever they went. She had changed her name, she said, as a personal and private decision made under the pressure of unending public judgment. She and Victor had relied, she said, on their siblings for support, because the communities around them had turned away. Victor Turner was briefer. He said he was glad it was over. He said he was still sad because he still did not know what had happened to his son. He said he had always wanted to find out who did it. He said it had been hard, and that he was glad he could hold his head up. For those who believe in the investigators' conclusions, for Justine's family, for the detectives who spent years working this case, for the community that had lived with this question for 35 years, those words rang with a particular hollowness. The claim of ignorance about who killed Justine. The claim of wanting to find the real killer. The 35 years of silence toward the sheriff's office. The changed name. The move away from Monk's Corner. All of it, viewed through the lens of what investigators believed, pointed not to the grief of innocent parents wrongly accused, but to something very different. But the law had spoken. And the law had spoken finally. This story would not be complete without spending time with the people who gave years of their professional lives to trying to find justice for Justine Lee Turner. Because behind every cold case investigation there are real human beings who carry these cases not as abstractions or professional exercises but as personal commitments. Sidney Wren, the original investigator, built the first case against Pamela Turner in the months after Justine's death. He believed he knew what had happened. He believed the evidence pointed in one direction. He lived for years with the knowledge that the case he had built was not enough, that the tools available to him in 1989 and 1990 did not allow him to make what he knew into what he could prove. In interviews years later, he spoke about that frustration with the candor of someone who had worked a case long enough and hard enough to have earned the right to be honest about its limitations. Lieutenant Dean Kakinda had been working on the Justine Turner cold case for years before it was formally reopened in 2021. He told a reporter in 2019 that he had been on the case for approximately 2 years at that point, and that he was hopeful that newly submitted evidence might finally yield results. He acknowledged the specific challenges of cold cases, the fading memories, the dying witnesses, the people who had moved on or moved away, but he said that even if the specific forensic hope did not pan out, he would still be working the case. That is the ethos of a cold case investigator. Not conditional commitment but absolute commitment. You work the case because the case deserves to be worked, not because you are guaranteed a result. Sheriff Dwayne Lewis took the case personally in the way that good law enforcement leaders take unsolved child murders personally. He reopened the case formally. He assembled the coalition. He stood at the press conference in January of 2024 with genuine feeling and described Justine in terms that went beyond the professional to the human. When the charges were dismissed in June, his statement was honest and measured. He said it was not the outcome he had sought. He said he understood the legal reasoning. He said his cold case detectives worked tirelessly to bring justice to victims and families. That is a statement from someone who believed in what his team had done and who was not willing to let the dismissal become a verdict on the quality of the investigation. The technology that the reinvestigation brought to bear on this case deserves its own examination, because it represents both the remarkable advances in forensic science and the real limitations of what even modern science can accomplish with old evidence. The fiber analysis that became central to the case was conducted using techniques that did not exist in anything like their current form in 1989. Forensic fiber analysis has advanced enormously over the past 30 years. The combination of advanced microscopy, which allows forensic scientists to examine individual fibers at levels of magnification and resolution that were not previously achievable, and spectroscopic analysis, which can characterize the chemical composition of fibers with great precision, allows modern forensic scientists to make comparisons and reach conclusions that would have been simply impossible for their counterparts 3 decades ago. When investigators submitted the ligature and the shirt collar to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division for analysis, they were betting that those advances in technology would produce results that had been unavailable to Sidney Wren in 1989 and 1990. The results were significant. The fiber evidence was found to be consistent, physically and chemically consistent, between the ligature and the inside of Justine's shirt collar. The forensic scientists concluded that the ligature had the characteristics capable of causing the strangulation documented at autopsy. That was meaningful evidence. It was the product of serious, credentialed forensic work. And it was the best available physical link between the murder weapon and the crime. But fiber analysis is not DNA. A finding of fiber consistency is different from a finding of identity, and the distinction matters enormously in a courtroom. When a DNA forensic scientist testifies to a match, they can speak in terms of statistical probabilities so vanishingly small that any reasonable juror understands the identification is effectively certain. When a fiber analysis forensic scientist testifies to consistency, they are saying that the fibers could have come from the same source, not that they did, with mathematical certainty, but that they could have. A skilled defense attorney can challenge that conclusion, can find a competing forensic expert who will testify to the limitations of fiber analysis, can raise the question of whether consistent means the same as identical, and can introduce enough technical uncertainty to give a jury pause. What the case really needed, and did not have, was the dog collar. The collar that investigators believed had been placed around Justine's neck and pulled tight. If that collar had been preserved, it could have been subjected to DNA analysis. There might have been biological material, skin cells, trace blood, anything, that would have allowed forensic scientists to place a specific person at the point of contact between the alleged murder weapon and Justine's body. Without the collar, that possibility was gone. And the absence of the physical murder weapon from a prosecution built around a theory of how the victim was killed is a significant hole, the kind of hole that defense attorneys are paid to find and to widen. The camper's absence was a different kind of loss. The camper was the crime scene of the concealment. A properly preserved camper could have been examined for trace biological evidence, for fingerprints, for any material that might have been transferred between the person who carried Justine's body and the space where it was hidden. 3.5 decades after the fact, that evidence was gone along with the vehicle that contained it. These losses, the collar, the camper, the urine-stained clothing, were losses of time. Not of negligence, though the failure to preserve the camper might be questioned. They were losses produced by the passage of years in which no one was certain that these specific items would ever be needed in a prosecution. That is one of the fundamental challenges of evidence preservation in open cold cases. You do not always know, at the time of the original investigation, which specific items will turn out to be most important 30 years later. The community of Moncks Corner and Berkeley County carried this case in its communal memory across 3.5 decades in ways that are difficult to fully quantify but impossible to overlook. Sheriff Lewis described the impact of Justine's murder on the community in terms that were both official and personal. The case had reverberated throughout the close-knit community about 30 miles north of Charleston for decades, marking a departure from more innocent times. That phrase captures something real and specific. Before Justine, children in communities like Moncks Corner walked to bus stops alone without anyone thinking twice about it. After Justine, that ease changed. The assumption that children were safe in their own neighborhoods, on their own roads, among their own neighbors, was shaken in ways that did not fully recover. People who were children in 1989 grew up to become the adults of 2024, and many of them carried Justine's story with them. People who were adults in 1989 were elderly or gone by the time the arrests were announced. The story passed between generations the way all community stories pass, through families, through local reporting, through the informal network of shared memory that constitutes the living history of a place. Throughout it all, Amy Parsons was the thread that kept the case connected to the present. Her decades of advocacy represented something remarkable, the willingness to keep pushing through grief and frustration and the repeated experience of raising hope only to have it deferred. Each new sheriff received her phone call. Each new set of leads received her encouragement. Each media cycle that touched on the case found her willing to speak. That kind of sustained advocacy is exhausting and costly in the specific way that sustained grief is exhausting and costly, and the fact that she maintained it for 35 years says something profound about both the strength of her love for Justine and the weight of the injustice she had been carrying since she was 8 years old. Let us spend a moment thinking about the Evenitz question seriously, because it deserves that serious treatment. Richard Mark Evenitz was born in Columbia, South Carolina. He served in the Navy, which gave him access to ports up and down the East Coast. His confirmed crimes involved the abduction, rape, and murder of young children in Virginia in the late 1990s. His method, approaching children near their homes or near bus stops, in suburban and rural areas, in the daylight, bore structural similarities to the circumstances of Justine's disappearance. The timing of his confirmed presence in Charleston on March 3, 1989 is a genuine coincidence that cannot be simply waved away. At the same time, there are aspects of the Justine Turner case that do not match Evenitz's confirmed pattern. Evenitz's 3 known murder victims were young girls, not a young boy. Justine's body was found on the Turner property, not disposed of elsewhere as Evenitz disposed of his Virginia victims. And the forensic evidence connecting the ligature found inside the Turner home to Justine's strangulation wounds points to a murder weapon that was inside the house, not something an outside perpetrator would have had access to. Neither of those observations is conclusive. Evenitz told his sister he had committed more crimes than he could remember, which means his known pattern may not represent the full range of his behavior. And an outside perpetrator who somehow gained access to the house, or whose identity involves a connection to the house, cannot be ruled out in the absence of definitive proof. What the Evenitz angle does, in the context of this case, is introduce genuine uncertainty. Not certainty of innocence for the Turners, but genuine uncertainty about the full picture of what happened. And in a criminal prosecution, genuine uncertainty is legally significant, because the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt requires that uncertainty be resolved before a conviction can be entered. The justice system as we have it is built around two foundational commitments that are sometimes in tension. The first is the commitment to holding people accountable for their crimes, the principle that violence and cruelty will not be allowed to pass without consequence, that victims will be vindicated, that society will not simply absorb the harm done to its members without responding. The second is the commitment to fairness in the process of accountability, the principle that no one will be convicted without due process, that defendants have the right to confront the evidence against them, that the state must prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and that where a fair trial is not possible, prosecution should not proceed. When those two commitments point in the same direction, the system works as it is designed to. When they point in opposite directions, as they did in this case, the system is forced to choose. And the system chose, in the Justine Turner case, to prioritize the procedural commitment, the right to a fair trial, at the cost of the substantive commitment, justice for a murdered child. That choice, made by Judge Roger Young on June 7, 2024, was legally defensible. It was defensible in the specific terms of the legal doctrine of pre-indictment delay and the constitutional guarantee of a fair trial. The principle being upheld is a real and important one. Without the protection against prejudicial delay, the state could sit on evidence indefinitely and bring charges at a moment of maximum disadvantage to the defendant, using the passage of time as a strategic tool. The rule against pre-indictment delay prevents that. But the application of a valid legal principle can produce an unjust outcome in a specific case, and in this specific case, the outcome was unjust in the most fundamental sense. A 5-year-old child was murdered. The people who investigators believed killed him lived free for 34 years. And the formal system of justice, having finally moved to act, was turned back not because the investigators were wrong or the evidence was fabricated but because too much time had passed. The system that was supposed to deliver accountability had itself failed, through inadequate original investigation, through insufficient evidence preservation, through the slow erosion of witnesses and materials, and now the formal acknowledgement of that failure took the form of permanent protection for the alleged perpetrators. Justine Lee Turner would have been 40 years old in 2024. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment before moving toward the end of this story. 40 years old. Not old. Not even middle-aged in the contemporary sense. A person in the prime of their life, with work and relationships and the ordinary daily texture of living still ahead of them. A person who might have children of their own, who might, in fact, have a 5-year-old child of their own, a child who was exactly the age Justine was when he died. Instead, he is 5 years old forever. He exists in memory as a kindergartner with blonde hair and a bowl of cereal and a small dog named Freeway. He exists in a handful of photographs, in the memories of the people who knew him, in court documents and news reports and now in the growing record of true crime media that has told his story. He does not exist anywhere else. His cousin Amy Parsons grew up to be his advocate. His family grew older while carrying the specific burden of the bereaved who believe they know the truth but cannot make the formal world agree with them. The investigators who worked his case lived with the particular frustration of knowing and not being able to prove. The community of Moncks Corner was changed by his death in ways that persisted across decades. All of that is part of what was taken from the world when Justine Lee Turner was killed. Not just a little boy, though a little boy is enough, more than enough. But everything a little boy becomes. Everything he does. Every person he touches. The ripple effects of his absence, spreading outward across 35 years to reach people who never knew him but who are nevertheless affected by the shape of the world that existed after his death. Someone knows what happened in that house on Horseshoe Road in the late evening of March 2 or the early morning hours of March 3, 1989. Someone knows what was done to Justine Lee Turner. Someone has lived with that knowledge for more than 35 years, and that knowledge has been their companion through every day of those 35 years, at family dinners and birthday celebrations and ordinary Tuesday afternoons and the quiet moments before sleep. It lives with them. It will always live with them. The legal process in this case is over. Judge Young's ruling has closed the door on prosecution permanently. No new evidence, no new forensic technique, no new witness, no confession given in a living room or a hospital bed, can open that door again. That is the finality of dismissal with prejudice. But truth does not require a courtroom. Truth does not require a verdict. The truth of what happened to Justine Lee Turner exists somewhere in the world, fixed and unchangeable, whether or not it is ever formally acknowledged in a legal setting. And the act of speaking that truth, even now, even with the legal window sealed shut, even with prosecution no longer possible, remains available to anyone who carries it. For Justine's family, the question of whether the truth will ever be fully spoken is a question that may never be answered. But it is not a question they will stop asking. It is not a case they will stop caring about. And it is not a little boy whose name they will allow to be forgotten. Justine Lee Turner. 5 years old. Moncks Corner, South Carolina. March 3, 1989. He ate his cereal and walked toward a dirt road and never came home. His dog was named Freeway. He had blonde hair. He was a kindergartner. He loved cinnamon cereal. He deserved to grow up. He deserved to grow up. And the very least that everyone who has ever told his story, reported on his case, worked his investigation, or simply listened and cared and felt the weight of what was done to him and what was not done for him, the very least any of us can do is refuse to let him be forgotten. To keep saying his name. To keep telling his story. To keep insisting that what happened to him mattered and that the failure to deliver justice for him was a real failure, a genuine loss, a wound in the fabric of what a just society should be. That is what Coldcase Crimelab is here to do. Case by case. Story by story. Name by name. We are here to say the names of the ones who can no longer say them for themselves, and to refuse to let the world move on as if those names don't matter. Justine Lee Turner. We say your name. We tell your story. And we will not forget you. That brings us to the end of the story of Justine Lee Turner. But it does not bring us to the end of Coldcase Crimelab. We are here every single week bringing you the cases that deserve to be told, the voices that deserve to be heard, and the victims who deserve to be remembered. If this story moved you, if you are carrying Justine's name with you now, then please do 3 things. Hit that like button right now if you have not already. Subscribe to Coldcase Crimelab and ring that notification bell so you never miss when we drop a new case. And share this video. Share it with someone who cares about justice, about truth, about the stories that the world has tried to bury. Every share brings Justine's story to someone new. Every subscription tells the algorithm that cold cases matter and that the people in them deserve to be more than just a file number in a drawer. We will see you on the next case. And until then, never stop asking questions. Never stop saying the names.